please accept our welcome to the February program. Before Rick Thorpe introduces Darcy, I'd like to just bring you up to date on a few things that have been happening with Odyssey. As you know, we had to cancel our second January program, the investment panel. Our 4 panelists were stranded in New York City because of the snowstorm. We've tried to reschedule them, but because of trying to balance 4 schedules and the busy club calendar, we've not been able to do it this season, but we are working on getting them back next season. So we'll look forward to that, and there'll be more news on that in our pamphlet that comes out this summer. Secondly, the next program is with golf psychologist or sports psychologist Dr. Rick Jensen. He was here 3 or 4 years ago. Everyone liked him. He's going to be back with some new ideas for all of us, so we hope to see you then. And lastly, somewhat sad for us, our chairperson for the last 4 years, Dennis Kerrigan, has left Harbour Ridge. He'd been trying to sell his home for a long time, and he finally succeeded. So he has departed at the end of January. We had hoped to do this at the January program, but we couldn't. So in absentia, we're expressing our appreciation to Dennis for 4 years of leadership of this group. Thanks. So without further ado, Rick Thorpe is going to introduce our special presenter tonight.
Crib notes. In case, as Jamie calls it, I have an intellectual interlude. Louder? How's that? Is that better? Closer to the chin, she said. Anyway, this is fantastic, overwhelming. I think Darcy is going to be so pleased to see so many of you this evening. You're an experienced man, I know. You can tell me how to do this. Anyway, early last year, when we were planning the Odyssey series for this year, there was an overwhelming vote that we invite Darcy back to speak at Odyssey again, since she was so well received 3 or 4 years ago. Fortunately, I was the one to try and bring this together and make it happen. And delightfully, it has. So we're so pleased. We don't have many repeaters at Odyssey, but Darcy is an experienced speaker in the Stewart, Palm City area. She's spoken to our artisans group here at Harbour Ridge. She's spoken to the Elliott Museum. She's spoken at her church, St. John's Episcopal. So, St. Mary's. St. Mary's. I wrote down St. John's. Okay, St. Mary's. Excuse me. I'd like to make it clear that all the material that Darcy is delivering tonight is fresh, new material. There's nothing to be repeated. So there's been a tremendous amount of research over the past few months that have gone into this talk. Darcy's used Google, of course, the internet extensively. She has a vast collection of her own art books that she's used for her research. And best of all, and fortunately, she was able to travel. She went to Madrid in Spain, to the Prado Museum to see work of Velázquez. She went to The Hague in the Netherlands to see works of Rembrandt. She also traveled to the National Gallery in London to do further research. So she's done a terrific amount of work. The Odyssey mission is to provide informative, educational programs. I think tonight Darcy is going to live up to this criteria 100%. So we welcome our friend and neighbor, Darcy Weir. There you go.
Thank you. Can you hear me out there? Very nice, thank you. And I do thank Rick Thorpe and the Odyssey Board for asking me to do another Odyssey presentation. And I thank all of you, friends, family, and people who have been coerced, for coming out tonight to see if I can tempt you into going Baroque without the Gilt. This is supposed to be working. Why is it not? Please work. There we go. Without the Gilt and without Rubens. And you know the rules. You've all had a glass of wine or two at dinner, and some of you are holding them right now, but it's strictly forbidden to fall asleep during this presentation. And to that end, my husband Jamie and several other anonymous agents will be patrolling this crowd equipped with tasers. If you begin to nod off, your health will suffer. And now, Michael and Teresa, you can lock the doors. The last time I spoke before an Odyssey audience was to talk about the Medici family and the early Italian Renaissance. And in a way, this presentation builds on that foundation. For those of you who weren't here for that talk, or for those who have forgotten it, during the Renaissance, artists discovered all the tools necessary to create very realistic likenesses of our material world. And for a time, that seemed to be the sole objective of painting, to create an illusion in 2 dimensions of this 3-dimensional world. The tools they developed, and which the artists we're going to be looking at tonight inherited, were these. A classical sense of proportion, both in architecture and in the human body. I'm sorry, when we went through these earlier, it wasn't cutting off that way. I don't know why the titles have been cut off. I apologize for that. Also, a very deep knowledge of the human anatomy, an understanding of how to create the illusion of depth by using aerial perspective, where colors in the foreground, as you can see, are very vivid, and then they fade gradually to kind of a bluish gray in the background, as well as tackling and learning how to use linear or mathematical perspective, where parallel lines intersect at a particular point on the horizon called the vanishing point. The Italians learned from their northern counterparts, such as the Van Eyck brothers, how to use oil-based paint to give a sense of greater transparency and the bright reflection of light, as captured here in the twinkle in Van Eyck's eye. It's that kind of reflection that oil paint gives. Finally, they learned how to create etchings and prints that could be duplicated by advances in printing technology and disseminated throughout the known world. So what remained for succeeding generations to do? It's a good question, and one that was answered in completely different ways by the artists we're looking at tonight. Those 3 artists, Nicolas Poussin, Diego Velázquez, and Rembrandt, were all born within a very few years of one another, all close to the beginning of the 17th century. There's no record of them ever meeting one another. But they were all faced with this dilemma. What do you do as a painter once all the tricks of the trade are known, and there's no longer any challenge to creating a realistic illusion of 3-dimensional space on the 2-dimensional surface of a canvas or wall, as Raphael has done so magnificently here with the School of Athens? A similar dilemma faces artists today, now that photography, film, and computer-generated 3D digital images have reached the level of art. What motivates an artist to keep painting? And what new goals did they set for themselves? Well, right now I'd like to set the stage a bit and take a look at the larger historical context in which these 3 artists functioned. The world had changed considerably since the time of the Italian Renaissance. The church had split in two with the Protestant Reformation. As you can see, the Catholic countries in the yellowish brown, the Protestant countries in the various other colors. The Protestant church totally opposed the display of art in churches, and consequently they were not patrons. The Catholic Church had been forced to crack down on the conspicuous display of wealth, including what they considered to be profane art projects. It continued to be a major patron of the arts, but with a very narrow agenda, enforced by the tribunal of the Inquisition. No more Greek and Roman mythological figures, no more gratuitous nudity. The moment Michelangelo died in 1564, the church rushed to cover up the naughty bits in his nudes in the Sistine Chapel. And all the kind of mauve bits are where they painted over things that might disturb parishioners. Spain had increased in power throughout the 1500s and briefly attained a position of total dominance under Habsburg rule, fueled by gold and silver brought back from conquests in the New World by the Spanish fleet. However, with the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, the balance of power began to shift again, and Spain went into a slow decline throughout the 1600s. France was becoming a powerful nation-state under Louis XIII and Louis XIV, thanks in great part to the clever statecraft of the royal advisors Richelieu, Mazarin, and Colbert, who saw to it that all authority and power was centralized in Paris in the form of an absolute monarchy. England, although becoming ever more powerful since defeating the Spanish, was torn by civil war. When Charles I refused to yield to English and Scottish demands for a constitutional monarchy, he quite literally lost his head. Oliver Cromwell assumed the reins of power until the monarchy was reinstalled in 1660 under Charles II. All of this civil uproar meant that the British were not as much of a player in the world of art as she would subsequently become. No, the real power, the real wealth, was becoming concentrated in an entirely new place, the Dutch Netherlands, or what we now call Holland. While France and Spain were ruled by absolute monarchs and England was immersed in civil war, the Dutch Netherlands had successfully broken away from Spain and was no longer under the sway of church or crown. In fact, because of her religious tolerance, she became a refuge for all the Jews, Protestants, and Muslims who had been driven out of other European countries by the Inquisition, and who helped fuel the growth of this new republic. The country grew wealthy from shipping, trade, and manufacturing, and the wealth was more evenly distributed throughout the society than anywhere else in Europe, not concentrated in the hands of the happy few. The Dutch guilder became the default international currency, much as the dollar is today. You can get an idea of the reach of the Dutch East and West Indies companies founded early in the 17th century by looking here on this slide. The West Indies is indicated in dark green on the left, the East Indies Company in light green on the right, and their trading posts were all those little orange dots in between. In fact, these companies were essentially the world's first large corporations, trading in sugar, salt, gold, copper, tobacco, and slaves, among other things. It was in Holland in 1636 that the first futures market was created in order to facilitate trade in tulip bulbs. And in 1637, the speculative boom went spectacularly bust in what we now know as the tulip mania, when a single bulb could sell for more than 16 times a skilled worker's annual wage. Holland had the world's most secure bank, the first stock exchange, was in fact the first market-based economy. And this was to have a profound effect on every aspect of life, including the world of art. For it was in Holland that the first and only art market was born, long before any such thing existed elsewhere. The Dutch loved commodities and came to see paintings as yet another object, a commodity that could be bought and sold on the open market for whatever price the market would bear. If you've ever wondered when the commodification of art began, look no further. In this painting of a typical Dutch wall of treasures, coming to us from the 1600s, you see paintings, shells, coins, china, statuary, you name it, they were collecting it. In the 17th century, you might find 30 to 50 paintings in a home of relatively modest means. And the subject matter of these pictures reflected the interests of the common man. Landscapes, seascapes, still lifes, biblical scenes, domestic scenes, tavern scenes, all were subjects well suited for sale on the mass market. And it was the Dutch mass market that was the driving force in this new world of art. Holland at this time was the wealthiest country in the world, and artists were more than happy to give the eager buying public the kinds of paintings that they wanted to hang on their walls. Therefore, it's at this time that landscape, still life, and genre paintings of everyday life came into their own. Well, now that the scene is set, let's meet the three artists that I alluded to earlier. We'll take them in chronological order, beginning with Nicolas Poussin. And we'll be looking at them initially as they saw themselves in their self-portraits. Nicolas Poussin was born in 1594 in France, but he left as soon as he could and fled to Italy. Always a good idea in my mind, where he remained for most of his life. He left us two self-portraits, the only portraits of any kind that he's known to have painted, and they were done at the request of two of his patrons. Both tell us a great deal about the artist, why he came to be known as the philosopher-painter and became the iconic figure of the classical school of painting. The first, from 1649, age 55, was unfortunately cut down at some point. But we have a print taken from the original, which lets us see how it was intended to look. As you can see, he's pictured himself in front of an antique funerary monument with two putti, or cherubs, on either side of his body. And going back to the original, there's a legend above his head giving particulars about the inhabitant of the tomb, where he came from in France, that he's a member of the Academy of Rome, and so forth. Notice that he has a hint of a smile, which is significant. Poussin, in addition to being a Catholic, was an admirer of the Greco-Roman philosophy of Stoicism. And good Stoics were always philosophical, even grimly cheerful in the face of death. We also see that he has a pen or stylus in one hand, whereby he emphasizes his profession as an artist, and in the other hand he holds a book on art theory, which tells us that he takes an intellectual approach to art. In a sense, a very real sense, you have to think your way into a painting by Poussin in order to decode its meaning. The second self-portrait from the Louvre, and by far the more famous, shows the artist in front of several canvases. The rectangles formed by canvases and door frame, these pure geometric shapes, are one of the main characteristics of Poussin's painting. And they help to explain why he proved such an inspiration to Cézanne. Here is a landscape by Poussin, and you can see the geometric blocks, cylinders, obelisk, and so forth, which serve to structure the landscape. And the Cézanne doing the very same thing with blocks and vertical angles, horizontals structuring the scene. Poussin, again, using horizontals and these building blocks, rectangles, edifices, to hold the structure of the painting together, and Cézanne imitating him very deliberately. Again, Poussin using the water feature, which is then followed by a very angular, geometric construction of buildings back to the mountain structure, and Cézanne doing a very similar thing with buildings in the foreground, taking you off into the distance and then into the mountains for which he was famous. And so you can see how that leads to Cubism and Picasso and all the other people, Braque and so on, who follow in Cézanne's wake, who drew his inspiration from Poussin. These geometric forms and successive planes receding in space are an integral part of all of his work, even his landscapes, serving to lend a sense of order and stability to everything he paints. An epitaph or legend again appears, this time on a blank canvas, giving us his vital statistics, so to speak. And we note that once again he has some sort of booklet in his hands, consistent with his being a philosopher's man painter, a thinking man's painter. We notice that he wears a ring with a four-sided or pyramidal diamond, a well-known symbol of the Stoic virtues of stability, constancy, and strength of character. Finally, we notice a partial figure of a woman who wears a diadem in the painting behind Poussin. The diadem actually has a seeing eye in it. It's thought that she is a personification of painting, crowned as a goddess and as the greatest of the arts, with the eye in the diadem symbolizing penetrating intellectual vision, the eye of the mind. Painting was not to be seen as manual labor, but as an intellectual discipline, just like philosophy. The arms embracing the figure of painting are there to remind us that this is a portrait done for someone who was not only a patron, but also a friend. There's even a novel about Poussin entitled Nicolas Poussin, Friendship Embracing Painting. And that's how Poussin liked to view his works, as gifts exchanged amongst very refined and chosen friends, always for a certain price, of course. Perhaps because of his Stoic philosophy, Poussin cared nothing for royal honors or recognition. Louis XIII commanded him to return to France in 1650 and serve as the royal painter. But doing so made Poussin miserable. He hated the backbiting and the jealousy of the court, and he was unwilling to paint the huge altarpieces and vast interior decors that were his assignment. On the pretext that he needed to return to Rome to fetch his wife, Poussin fled the court after barely 2 years and never returned. His goal was to be free to paint images of a lost world, or a world that never existed, a world where classical ideals of beauty, harmony, and order prevailed. His works demanded an intellectual effort on the part of his patrons, as they were full of references to obscure myths and remote historical events. But he never wanted for a buyer. He sold everything that he created. He refused to tolerate having a stable of pupils or assistants under him, even though many artists made a very nice living this way. He wanted his privacy, or as Greta Garbo once said,
I just want to be alone.
And have complete control over his art. Unlike, for example, Rubens, whose teeming workshop churned out paintings by the dozen, many of which barely came in contact with the master's hand. And strange as it may seem to us today, Poussin's polished, learned, classical style became the technique preferred and taught in all the art academies across Europe. And these academies dictated the rules of good art on the continent for another 150 years. Let me show you a sample of Poussin's work to give you a feel for the man. Perhaps one of the best known and most characteristic works is the Arcadian Shepherds. It is set in a region of Greece, Arcadia, that was thought of as idyllic, a kind of simple paradise on earth. We see three young men who we know to be shepherds by their attire and by the staffs that they hold, and one of them is kneeling down before a funerary monument, tracing out the letters etched in its surface as the others look on. The shepherds are accompanied by a beautiful female with a classical Greek profile. She's dressed in regal golden attire. She's clearly not a shepherdess. And she smiles serenely as the young men try to decipher the tombstone's message. She's curiously reminiscent of the personification of painting, which we just saw in Poussin's self-portrait. And that's probably no coincidence. The legend the shepherds are spelling out reads, "Et in Arcadia ego," which means, even in Arcadia, I am present. Meaning, of course, that death is present even in this ideal setting. This is a very stoic reminder of death's inevitability, and it would seem that the beautiful woman is there to help the innocent shepherds come to grips with their own mortality. In Poussin's mind, art is the only thing on earth that lasts beyond the grave, and he would have the shepherds and the viewer, that is us, take some comfort in the fact that a beautiful painting will convey to future generations something of us when we're long gone, and in the meantime, encourage us to think our way into an ideal world, unlike that in which we live. It's not a cheery message, and it's not one that's easy to figure out if you just give the painting a cursory glance, but that is Poussin, ever the cerebral philosopher-painter. But now let's turn to Diego Velázquez, the Spaniard from Seville, born in 1599 and dubbed the painter's painter by Edouard Manet. In some ways, Velázquez is the opposite of Poussin. Born into a family with some small claim to nobility, but no great means, and in a country where nobility and a pedigree counted for everything, Velázquez determined that the only way to get ahead was by climbing the royal ladder of success. As a struggling young artist, aged 21 or 22, just moved to Madrid, Velázquez managed to catch the eye of King Philip IV's most important ministers, and eventually was given the test of painting the royal portrait. It was such a success that the king declared that he would not have his portrait painted by any other artist. In due course, he became Philip's favorite. Gradually, Velázquez ascended the ranks and grew ever closer, both physically and psychologically, to the king, going from lowly court painter to usher of the chamber, to assistant in the wardrobe, to assistant in the privy chamber, to superintendent of the royal palace, the highest rank possible, allowing him intimate access to the king at any time with all sorts of attendant rights and privileges. You'll notice that in this self-portrait, Velázquez depicts himself as the consummate courtier and gentleman. And although you can't see in this picture, as it is darkened with age, from his belt hang the keys to the king's chamber, and the master key to unlock every other palace door. Significantly, you don't see him displaying the tools of his trade. Gentlemen were not to be seen doing manual labor. The king genuinely loved his favorite court painter, even though Velázquez painted him in a realistic manner, not attempting to hide the famous Habsburg chin and the drooping lower lip. How would you like to have the job of painting this monarch and his entourage again and again, year after year, making certain that the royal image was known throughout all the courts of Europe and in every diplomatic circle? It doesn't bear thinking about. But in the very challenge of painting, developing his own illusionistic technique, Velázquez found enormous satisfaction. You see in the details of King Philip's brown and silver outfit how Velázquez impressionistically dabs in the ornamentation, giving the illusion, from a distance, of an elaborately, laboriously worked treatment, when in fact, that's not the case at all. This painterly technique was uniquely his own, way ahead of its time, and it was inspired by his research into the field of optics, how the human eye works using the sketchiest amounts of visual information, a few quick strokes of the brush to complete an image. If with Poussin you think your way into a painting, with Velázquez you see your way in. He likes to play with your eyes. In this, his only other self-portrait, we learn even more about the painter. This is Velázquez's most famous work, and it's impressively large. It's 10 feet by 9 feet, and when you see it in the Prado in Madrid, it almost seems as though you're entering into another room. It's so beautifully cast with the light and with the nearly life-size figures. A distinguished art critic once called it the theology of painting. And it is known as Las Meninas, after the young ladies attending the princess or infanta, the little blonde girl who is the focus of the painting. Many ponderous works have been written which purport to unlock the mysteries of this wonderful work, and I invite you to read them. But what do we learn about its creator, Velázquez, who pictures himself in the midst of the royal family? Well, first of all, we learn that he wants to emphasize that he is on intimate terms with the royals, who are all gathered around him at his easel, actually in his very own quarters in the palace. Velázquez is telling us that as a painter and a gentleman, he frequents the highest circles. Using a very neat visual device, the mirror at the rear of the room, we can see that the king and queen are either standing where we, the viewer, are standing, so that we have taken their place, or that the mirror is reflecting an image of a portrait that Velázquez is painting of the royal couple, who stand just to our left. Either way, it's clear that the painter has privileged access to the royal family, and that he is deliberately making us think about the act of seeing itself, asking ourselves what is really reflected there. Notice how many of the figures in the painting are looking out at us in a somewhat startled, spontaneous way, including the German dwarf Maribola. She is next to the Italian dwarf Nicola Pertusato, who is prodding the sleeping dog, the mastiff, with his foot. Now, dwarves were very common in the European courts at this time, and we'll talk about them more in a moment. This is utterly different from the normal, posed, formal royal portrait. It's more like a photograph, an impromptu snapshot. And we wonder, what exactly are they looking at? Are they looking at the king and queen who have just arrived? Are they looking at us, wondering what we are doing there? And wouldn't we be standing in the place where a mirror should be in order for the artist to be painting this picture? And if there is a mirror here, is this a painting of Velázquez painting this painting? In fact, this is a painting about the act of seeing and capturing an image, an illusion. And it is painted with such bravura technique. Just look at the way he executes the Infanta's little flower ornament. It's just amazing how he captures that with a few dots and dabs. And the details of his own sleeve, a few slashes of the brush. No wonder this work inspired many other artists, from John Singer Sargent to Picasso, who was obsessed with it. He did over 58 versions. That's the Infanta, and you can compare her. Here's the whole group assembled, and you can see the little boy with, I'm not sure exactly where the pointer is, there it is, with his foot on the dog. Infanta here, Velázquez with his cross in front of his easel. And a comparison. This is from 1957. He did many versions in that year. Another version where Velázquez is suddenly about 12 feet tall, and he has a lightning bolt where I showed you the sleeve that was so beautifully done, and he features his own dog called Lump, a dachshund, rather than the mastiff. Here's the little Infanta and the dwarf who has his foot on the dog, and so forth. He also influenced Salvador Dali, who entitled this painting rather wonderfully, Velázquez painting the Infanta Margarita with the lights and shadows of his own glory. Dali painted this to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the death of Velázquez and to pay homage both to his favorite Spanish painter, Velázquez, who's that tiny little figure you see down at the bottom, and to pay homage to the Prado where the Las Meninas hangs. It's even said that Las Meninas and Velázquez himself were the inspiration for that famous mustache of Dali's. And I think it's true. Although, again, we cannot make out his belt too clearly, we know that he is, again, wearing the keys which allowed him unique access to every room in the palace, and that he sports the coveted cross of the Order of Santiago. Now, there's a story behind this cross, the wearing of which signifies that Velázquez received the highest honor of knighthood in this distinguished order. He didn't receive the distinction until 2 years after he painted this picture, and legend has it that the king painted it on himself as a posthumous tribute to his beloved friend. Now, something in Velázquez needed this supreme outward recognition of his own innate nobility. To obtain the highest honor, that of knighthood, he would have to prove that his bloodline was free from taint, that is, no Jewish or Muslim ancestry, and that he had never been involved in trade, in working for a wage. That is, he had never sold any paintings for money. Now, this latter claim was simply absurd, and everybody knew it. Before serving Philip IV, Velázquez had made his living selling pictures and had certainly been remunerated for the many portraits he painted of the aristocrats who frequented the palace. So how was he going to prove that he was qualified to receive the knighthood that he so coveted? With all his pressing duties at the palace, he barely had time to paint, let alone secure all the documentation necessary for a knighthood. In fact, his last years, when his painting prowess was at its height, he had to use every spare moment to secure the knighthood, which is our great loss. But that was the price that Velázquez was willing to pay in order to achieve his goal. In the end, it took the king's personal intervention to secure this distinction for his friend. And he did so on the basis of Velázquez's singular achievement as an artist, which perhaps Las Meninas provided the clinching proof of. We might have preferred to have more of his paintings and forget about the knighthood, but that's not how Velázquez saw things. That's not what drove him. And perhaps in striving for his own personal validation as a nobleman, he was also fighting for the nobility of painting itself. For until that time, especially in Spain, painting was still a form of manual labor and not the occupation of a proper gentleman. The fact that Velázquez had to fight all his life for recognition made him especially sensitive to those who were excluded from the power structure or were, for whatever reason, vulnerable. and he painted these portraits with incredible verve. He showed a special tenderness toward the royal children, who, although in every way privileged, still didn't have a real childhood, and spent a great portion of their lives playing a role. The Infanta Margaret Teresa, pictured here, was betrothed as a child to her maternal uncle and paternal cousin, Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor. And portraits of her were regularly sent to him, here at age 2, again at age 3 or 4, again at age 5, again at age 8, so that he could see his little wife-to-be developing. This is before the internet and Facebook. Little Prince Balthazar Carlos, seen here with his dwarf playmate. You can note the command baton in his right hand, while his left hand is on a sword hilt, which appears in all his formal portraits. He was the royal hope for the future when he was born, he who was destined to ascend the throne upon his father's death. And Velázquez painted him throughout his young life as he learned to ride and hunt and take part in military displays. Here we see him dressed as a field marshal and executing complex equestrian maneuvers with his proud parents standing on the balcony in the background. Again, Velázquez plays with our ability to make out an image from the scantiest strokes of a brush. Prowess as a horseman and as a hunter was considered a sure sign that the young prince would be a great leader in battle and dominate whatever enemy he faced. But sadly, he died at age 16, never fulfilling the dream. But perhaps Velázquez's most interesting and touching portraits were of the dwarves and so-called fools who were kept to entertain the court, and who had the freedom occasionally to speak truths that no other courtier would dare utter. Velázquez was not the only painter ever to depict these marginal people, but he painted their portraits with a sensitivity and a tenderness that is his alone. And the fact that he did so many of them and depicted these fringe people with such dignity says a great deal about the painter's own capacity to identify with others who were less fortunate and to see them as real human beings. Manet was profoundly affected by these portraits when he discovered them in Spain, and they influenced his work enormously, as you can see in his portrait of Émile Zola, his friend, as he puts Zola in the position of El Primo, who was one of the main administrators of the palace. And in this picture, he's absolutely dwarfed, as you can see, by the huge books that he has. But Velázquez doesn't hesitate to paint him with great dignity, and Manet takes that over. Manet told his friend Baudelaire that Velázquez was the greatest painter that ever was, and he called this picture of the court buffoon Pablo de Valladolid declaiming a speech on stage perhaps the most astonishing piece of painting ever done. Nobody was painting like this at that time, just Velázquez. This kind of figure that surges out of empty space and casts his shadow on a non-existent wall. During Velázquez's second trip to Italy, where he went to acquire paintings and sculptures for the king's collection, Velázquez painted two of his most famous portraits. He'd been invited to paint Pope Innocent X's portrait, and in preparation for that, he asked his assistant, Juan de Pareja, to sit for him. Juan was an artist himself, trained by Velázquez, but as a Moorish slave, he was only allowed to help Velázquez with canvas preparation and the mixing of paints. Velázquez captures the innate pride and dignity in the pose of his fellow artist, but he also captures the indignation and a certain disdain that stream from Juan's smoldering gaze at the very fact that he, as a Moorish slave, couldn't practice his art openly, but only perform menial tasks for his Spanish master. It speaks well of Velázquez that he went on to free him from slavery that very year. In the meantime, Juan de Parea's sitting in preparation for the portrait of the Pope yielded amazing results, as this portrait of Innocent X makes clear. Both portraits were put on public display in Rome and received enormous accolades. They were a total triumph and earned Velázquez an entry into Rome's Royal Academy of Art. Now, some had warned that depicting the hot-headed Pope so realistically might get Velázquez in trouble. On the contrary, the Pope was extremely pleased and presented Velázquez with a medal and a golden chain, distinct marks of honor. Francis Bacon couldn't get this portrait out of his mind. He did more than 40 versions of it. I'm not sure Velázquez would have approved, but he was clearly influenced by Velázquez. The third artist I'd like you to get to know tonight, although I'm sure you've met him before, is Rembrandt, often called the Shakespeare of painters. Immediately, the fact that we know him by his first name tells you something about the man. From the beginning, Rembrandt had no doubt about his stature as an artist. The greatest painters who preceded him, Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Titian, were all known by their first names alone. Very early in his career, Rembrandt stopped signing pictures with his whole name and began simply putting his first name, Rembrandt. And that's how we've known him ever since. Had he not been a great painter, such a gambit would have appeared vain and foolish. But he was great. He knew it, and he knew that one day the rest of the world would recognize it too. We've looked at the self-portraits of Poussin and Velázquez. Each had 2 or possibly 3 to their name. Rembrandt had more than 90. In various media, realized at every stage of his life, from age 21 to his death at age 63. They comprise a unique volume of work, something no artist before or since has even begun to attempt, although they certainly inspired his fellow countryman Van Gogh to record his own image. Since they represent an extremely important part of his legacy, I brought a number of them together for you to appreciate very quickly tonight. In his early years, it's clear that he was using himself as a model, making faces, assuming roles, play acting in order to understand how a face expresses anger, surprise, good humor, fear. During the first 15 years or so of his career, he made a very good living painting portraits for the well-to-do merchants of Amsterdam, then the wealthiest city in the world. In 1534, he married the wealthy daughter of a very well-connected art dealer. Her name was Saskia van Uylenburg. And there she is. Here we see them together, and she's conveniently pushed into the background. Take note. In this self-portrait from 1636, Rembrandt clearly felt himself the cock of the walk and defiantly cast himself in the role of the prodigal son who deserted his family and squandered his inheritance in a faraway country on wine, women, and song, with his young wife Saskia impersonating a prostitute perched on his knee. I wonder how she felt about that. He's decked out with a fine sword and expensive finery, and a stuffed peacock is among the dishes that he's about to eat, one of the most extravagant and expensive in Dutch cuisine. This portrait from 1639 shows Rembrandt at the height of his commercial success and dangerously overextending himself to take out a mortgage on a very impressive, expensive mansion. This portrait from 1640 deliberately recalls Titian's famous portrait of a Venetian gentleman by imitating the sitter's pose, as you can see here. And he borrows the subdued palette of Raphael's celebrated portrait of his friend Balthasar Castiglione. adopting the elegant and sober outfit of a courtly gentleman. This was Rembrandt's way of claiming equality with two of the greatest portraitists of the Italian Renaissance, indeed of all time. In fact, Rembrandt became the best-known, most sought-after portraitist of his generation, and I'll just show you a few of his works to give you an idea. This is a noted furrier, and the fur of his garment is depicted rather wonderfully, as is his ruff. This is the famous anatomy lesson of Nicholas Tulp, which is in the Moritz House in The Hague, which I did go to visit very specially. I'd been to the Rijksmuseum the year before. And Rembrandt animates it by showing these two men, who are part of the group, looking directly out at us. Then there's a portrait of the firebrand Protestant preacher of the day. And Maria Tripp, very wealthy young woman, beautifully attired and bejeweled, and he takes great pains in showing the jewelry and finery of her lace. Rembrandt was a wily marketer, and he saw how advantageous it would be to have his own portrait appearing in collections throughout Europe. There was a big market in portraits of famous artists. He was in the process of perfecting the Rembrandt brand, if you will. Early in his career, he was occasionally commissioned to paint a religious altarpiece, and it's instructive to see how he paints a very personalized and almost homely version of Christ crucified. A very weak and attenuated Christ, and he introduces himself right in the middle as a participant. Whereas Velázquez, painting almost that same year, or within a year, treated the subject in the starkest terms imaginable, almost anonymous, cosmic, mysterious, with no hint of himself taking part in the action. What a contrast. In 1641, after losing 3 daughters who died in infancy, Saskia gave birth to the only child of this marriage to survive childhood, their son Titus, the apple of Rembrandt's eye. Just 1 year later, in 1642, Saskia died, probably of TB, but not before introducing a last-minute clause into her will that effectively prevented Rembrandt from remarrying. If he did, he would forfeit all claim to her considerable fortune, on which, with his wild spendthrift habits, he depended. You can't detect the effects of Saskia's death in the self-portraits from 1642 and 1643. In fact, he dresses himself up in the gold chains that artists were given by their wealthiest patrons as a mark of distinction. Now, these chains are a pure affectation. They're a costume. There's no record of Rembrandt actually ever receiving such gifts, unlike Velázquez, and he didn't care a thing about them. This is also the year he created his most well-known group portrait, which has come to be known as the Night Watch. It received that title erroneously after its coats of varnish had darkened with the years and made it appear to be taking place at night. Actually, it has a real mouthful of a name. The company of Captain Franz Benning Koch, who is this gentleman, and Lieutenant Willem van Reitenburg, preparing to march out. It's a theatrical piece set in shadows with daylight breaking in, a group portrait commissioned by a civic militia of musket bearers, which served no military function in Amsterdam at that time, where peace prevailed. Rembrandt gives the group life by making it seem as though the men are charging forth into battle, and with wonderful chiaroscuro. You can see the shadow that the captain's hand casts on his lieutenant's body. He makes our eye move from one place on the canvas to the next, drawing us into the imaginary drama by his use of light. It's a huge work, 12 by 14 feet. It's the pride of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, where it occupies a position of honor all its own. In 1644, when Rembrandt was 38, he penned this drawing, a cartoon, in fact, set in a parlor or studio where several paintings are being brought before an art critic who is passing judgment on the works before him. It's here that we detect for the first time a hint of bitterness or scorn on Rembrandt's part. Note that the critic has been given ass's ears, the sign that he is a dunce and doesn't know what he's talking about. On the right is an artist, perhaps Rembrandt himself, who was just defecated and is in the process of wiping himself clean. You couldn't have a more vivid picture of what Rembrandt thought of art critics and others who didn't like his style. It's true that as Rembrandt's style changed from being elegant, nuanced, and smooth, so smooth that the brushwork was invisible, to a style that was more raw, personal, and expressive, with heavy use of the palette knife, his commissions began to drop away. His wealthier Dutch customers wanted finished, highly polished reflections of their increasingly refined lifestyle. But Rembrandt refused. He went his own way. This portrait of his friend and sometime patron Jan Six is a good example of his later, looser, and more abbreviated style. You can see here in the very sketchy rendering of the details of Jan Six's coat and sleeves, how things are just sketched in, rather like Velázquez. Jan Six was a very learned, talented, and well-connected member of Dutch society, and although he bought a number of Rembrandt's works and tried to support him in a variety of ways, Rembrandt gave him a hard time. He was slow to deliver on paintings promised, painting what he liked as opposed to what was called for, and he stonewalled when it came to repaying debts. He refused to paint in the acceptable, finely finished style that used to be his trademark. The friendship seems to have broken down under the weight of Rembrandt's disregard for his patron and friend. And when it came time to have his wife's portrait done the following year, Six chose someone else to execute it. In fact, one of Rembrandt's chief rivals and a former student, Govert Flinck. Rembrandt didn't seem to care. He mistreated all his patrons, demanded payment for work not done, and made them sit long and tedious hours for portraits when he deigned to paint them at all. You'll notice that after 1648, the style of self-portraiture changes, as does his work in general. He no longer mimes for the mirror. He doesn't indulge in role play. From this time until his death, his work becomes far more poignant and introspective. As the application of paint gets thicker, as the dabs and dashes and blobs become more rough, he appears to be going deeper and deeper into himself, and perhaps into the roughest terrain of his own soul. If we said a moment ago that you think your way into Poussin's painting, and you see your way into Velázquez, from this point on, you feel your way into Rembrandt's work. After Saskia's death, Rembrandt had a brief and unfortunate dalliance with this woman, whom he had hired to look after his son, Titus. When Rembrandt tried to dismiss her, she sued him for breach of promise, and Rembrandt was ordered to give her support payments as his common-law wife. His response was to have her locked up in prison as being mentally unstable. Perhaps not his most glorious moment. In 1649, he hired another woman as both housekeeper and nanny, and again, he took her as his mistress. This woman was Heinricha Stoffels, who proved to be a true soulmate and the model for many of his most famous pictures of women. When she became pregnant with Rembrandt's child in 1654, the Protestant courts came down hard and repeatedly summoned her to appear before a tribunal, under the charge of having, and I quote, lived with Rembrandt the painter as a whore. Finally, when her pregnancy became obvious to all, she was expelled from the church, and Rembrandt was thrown out of the Amsterdam Painters Guild, which meant that he could no longer sell his own works under his own name. Titus and Heinrike managed the business for him. We have no portrait of Rembrandt from that year, but we do have one of Heinrike. In fact, a nude of her as Bathsheba, the woman King David lusted after, summoned to his bed, and ended up impregnating. The tryst later led to King David having Bathsheba's husband put to death, adultery followed by murder. In this famous picture, we have a brooding, poignant image of Heinrike, or Bathsheba, reflecting on the king's summons, which she holds in her hand, and all that it implies for her future. Painted in the very year Heinrike became pregnant with Rembrandt's child and was expelled from the church. When you compare that to a Poussin nude, here of a nymph being leered at by a satyr in an idyllic mythological setting, or Velázquez's rear view of a beautifully curvaceous Venus, known as the Rokeby Venus, gazing in the mirror and looking desirably real, you get an idea of the different styles and concerns of each painter. Poussin was ordered to paint this titillating kind of scene for Cardinal Richelieu for his own private salon back in France. Velázquez was commissioned to paint this, it is thought, for a notoriously debauched friend of the Spanish king, whose mistress slept on black satin sheets, just like these. He could never have painted it had he not been the king's favorite, sojourning in Italy, and had not the commission been completely private, beyond detection by the Spanish Inquisition. An irreverent curator for the Hispanic Society of America once called this the most smackable ass in art history. In 1656, 1 year after this portrait, Rembrandt was forced to declare bankruptcy. And from 1656 to 58, all his worldly possessions were inventoried and sold at auction, bringing in a disappointingly small amount of money. However, some of his greatest works, among them these self-portraits, stem from this very period. They seem to show a man who could at last look deeply into his own eyes and into ours, with a kind of penetration that doesn't allow us to turn away. In 1660, he was forced to give up the large house that he and Saskia had purchased. It's now the Rembrandt Museum, and move into a modest house in the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam. Here, Rembrandt lived in great simplicity, but also with great contentment. He devoted himself entirely to his art and became more daring and original than ever before. Thanks to the Dutch art market, Rembrandt could break free of the patronage system that so ill-suited his prickly temperament. He painted whatever he wanted to paint and took his chances selling what he painted on the open market. He also made money from students who came to him for instruction throughout his life, and he was known far and wide in Europe thanks to his etchings, which were small, inexpensive, and continued to sell everywhere. Most of these are no more than 2 by 4 inches, or in this case, 1 inch by 7. Famous 100 guilder print of Christ preaching and the people needing to be healed or being brought to him, as are the little children. And the print known as the 3 Crosses. To lighten this up, you'll be glad to know that a fellow member has brought in an original etching of Rembrandt's, which is before me, of a golfer, which you're invited to see after this talk. But in his later years, When Rembrandt was at the height of his powers and not constrained by the demands of a patron, to what did he turn for inspiration? What subjects did he choose to treat? More often than not, he turned to the Bible and its timeless stories, its unforgettable characters. He sought instruction from the Jewish rabbis and elders in the neighborhood where he now lived in Amsterdam, the Jewish quarter. And he found in the faces of the men and women of that quarter the models he needed to represent Moses, Simeon, Isaac and Rebekah, otherwise known as the Jewish bride, the Virgin of Sorrow, Jesus himself. In a curious way, Rembrandt seemed to be finding himself. One of his most poignant images comes from 1659, where Rembrandt draws from the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel. The tale is told in the book of Genesis. Jacob and his brother Esau were twins, and although Esau was the elder, Jacob managed through unscrupulous means to steal away his older brother's birthright. And later he will steal the blessing that Isaac, their father, had intended for the elder son. In fact, that's Jacob's modus operandi, obtaining whatever he wants through trickery and a chameleon-like ability to assume whatever persona the occasion demanded. When the going gets tough, he goes on the lam. But Jacob's day of reckoning finally arrived, when he had to return home from a faraway land to face the wrath of the brother he had cheated. On the night before the brothers are to meet, Jacob is alone in the wilderness, and out of the darkness leaps a figure who seizes him, locks him in a vise-like grip, and they begin to wrestle. It's the fight of Jacob's life. And he will not release the strange being who has assaulted him, even when that being, who is in fact an angel, demands to be set free. Jacob clings to the angel and demands a blessing before he'll turn him loose. The angel ignores Jacob's demand and pointedly asks in turn for Jacob's identity, his name. When Jacob replies that he is Jacob, which literally means the supplanter, the deceiver, the angel rechristens him, giving him a new identity, the name Israel. He who struggles, wrestles with God and with man, and who at last prevails. Before the angel departs, he does indeed bless Jacob, as well as wound him in the thigh to leave a reminder in Jacob's flesh of this fateful encounter. In Rembrandt's picture, the battle is over, and Jacob, now Israel, is at peace in the angel's embrace. The angel gazes down on the exhausted man with infinite tenderness. Rembrandt was a keen student of the Bible, and I can't help but feel that he poured his own soul into this image, a soul that had wandered, wrestled with God and man, tried on different identities, only to cast them off and recklessly seek a better fit, meanwhile provoking a lot of collateral damage. It's from this very time that several of Rembrandt's most profoundly personal portraits come. And it seems to me that he had finally, like Jacob, found in God his real identity, his own name and blessing. And he'd need that kind of rock-solid assurance, for the last years of Rembrandt's life were painful ones. In 1663, he lost his beloved soulmate, Hendrika, when the plague swept through Amsterdam. His only son, Titus, was married in 1668, only to die several months later. It was in 1668-69 that Rembrandt painted what was one of his last and among his greatest works, The Return of the Prodigal Son. You'll remember that some years before, he had cast himself in the role of the insolent young prodigal, who had demanded his inheritance prematurely in order to live a life of self-centered hedonism. At the end of his life, Rembrandt returned to that theme, but with a different emphasis entirely. The prodigal has finally returned, miserable, destitute, penitent, finally realizing what a fool he's been to leave all that he loved behind. Rembrandt had been that young man. He had also become the father who knew what it was to lose a son. And he had been the elder brother, critical and judgmental, always certain that he was right. It would seem that in this, close to his last picture, he too had come home and at last found peace. So 3 different men, 3 very different drives among the 3 greatest artists of the 17th century. We asked at the beginning of this talk, what was there left for them to do when so much had already been done and discovered in the world of art? Poussin answered that question by using his art to create an ideal intellectual construct where the values of the classical world still ruled and where the weight of our mortality could be lightened by the beauty and the permanent promise of art. Another, Velázquez, answered the question by using his art to gain recognition, to see himself and his art publicly acknowledged as worthy of the highest distinction that his world had to offer. And he was willing to sacrifice everything to that end. And finally, Rembrandt, who used the tools of his craft throughout his life to explore the contours of identity, to search for himself. And in the end, he seems to have succeeded, finding himself in the arms of God. Rubens may have been the most successful artist at the time, but it's these 3 artists that have exercised the greatest influence throughout succeeding generations. And although Poussin is now relatively out of fashion, and Velázquez was unknown for more than a century after his death until he was rediscovered when Napoleon invaded Spain and looted the royal art collection, Rembrandt alone has never gone out of fashion or faded from view. Perhaps because so many of his pictures treat timeless themes drawn from the Bible, drawn from the nitty-gritty of life, and because he fought the hardest to understand and express exactly what it is to be human, to gain and own his identity, to be real. I thank you. Thank you. Now, I'm very glad to entertain a few questions before I go home and have a big glass of wine. But if you do have questions, please don't hesitate. I think there is a microphone circling around the room, so just raise your hand and indicate, or if you would like to go home, that's fine too. The doors, yes, the doors have just been unlocked, and you've been very kind. I didn't see many people sleeping. Question down here, Jim Mondello. I did write that. No, I cribbed it off the internet. Oh, sweet. We'll talk. Thank you, Jim. Thank you. Any other questions, except asking if I plagiarized it?
Darcy, I just want to say I think we all, everyone here, appreciates the time, the effort that you put in to put this all together. It's magnificent.
Thank you, Maureen.
Absolutely magnificent.
Well, thank you all. You've been a great audience.
And I just wanted to, one question. We know where Rembrandt's got all of his money and how in Holland the merchants and how all his paintings were sold. But what about the other 2? Did they get into a market in their countries, or what happened to them?
Well, the market was very different, as you have seen in the rest of Europe from Holland. In the rest of Europe, the academy ruled. A painter had to qualify to get into the academy, to have his paintings shown, and it had a very strict system. It was hierarchical. You had to paint a certain kind of picture that was based on the kind of style of Michelangelo, Raphael, the classical Renaissance artists. And at the top of the pyramid of the type of paintings that could be submitted was what was called a history painting, which could be indeed a famous historical event like Horatio at the Bridge, or it could be a mythological scene or a religious scene, and it had to be big. It was submitted to the salon that any of these art academies, which now existed in European countries, had. And if it was accepted, given the imprimatur of the academy shown at the salon, then that artist was well known and accepted, and his work was saleable. It was very hard for an artist to sell his work otherwise. You could have a private patron, as Poussin was lucky enough to have, as Velázquez found with the king, but others had to qualify through the academy route, and it was very tough. Contrary to all that we think about art, their hierarchy of genres, starting off with this history painting at the top, the history painting was considered the best because it was totally imagined. The artist had to dream up what this mythological event or religious event looked like, whereas all the other genres below it, the next below it was portrait, and then it was landscape, then it was genre scene, and animal portraiture, and finally at the very bottom, still life. All of those you had the real subject before your eyes, and so it was considered not a sufficient challenge. So the closer you got to reality, the less they appreciated the technique. That was the style that prevailed in the rest of Europe, but not in Holland, where they really appreciated the approach to morality, or to normality, to our daily life, and their own country, the seascapes, the landscapes, the riches of the table and of fruits and vegetables. The stuff of everyday life is what the Dutch liked. So very, very different, and a very different route to success. You've been very patient, so I will allow you to go now. You're very welcome. Very welcome.